to the Grind to Growth to Greatness podcast. The best and brightest entrepreneurs, CEOs, creators, athletes. We'll talk to them all, and we'll get the good, the bad, and the ugly on how they made it. Decoding the secrets of success. Grind to Growth to Greatness podcast. Unveiling the paths to success. And now your host, Terry Barr.
Hey, good afternoon. It's Terry Barr with Grind to Growth to Greatness. And I've got a great guest today. You know, on this podcast, we talk about CEOs, entrepreneurs, creators, all around interesting people. And this lady actually checks all the boxes. So we're excited to bring her to you. Her name is Franny Kansteiner, and she's right here in Virginia, in the rolling hills of Virginia, if you will. And she owns Gumtree Farms. And they have about a flock of 200 sheep, Merino Wool Sheep, that she is the mother of these sheep. She's the shepherd of these sheep. And she takes them from shearing to design. She's got this beautiful line of clothing. I was at her storefront today looking at them so I could see what they were all about. Just gorgeous stuff. So welcome in, Franny. We can't wait to hear about your story. We're about ready to go. We're on location today, so we're doing it a little differently, but we're about to go on a little bit of a trip. She's a big horse person, but she is the true shepherd of these sheep. So we're going to go on we're going to watch a feeding. We're going to talk to her along the way. So I hope you enjoy Franny Kansteiner. Welcome in. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much.
I appreciate it.
Welcome to the farm.
All right.
Come, we'll grab the grain. And these lambs that we are feeding, they were born in November, and they stayed with their mom until the end of January, and now we have weaned them. Okay. And so they are learning to eat on their own. In a few weeks, when the moms are good and recovered, but not making milk anymore, we'll let the lambs go back out with the bigger flock. But you'll meet these little guys up front, up close, and they're pretty charming. This is an organic feed that we get delivered here, and it's at the lucky that we have a neighbor who has much bigger farm, and she does a lot of organic stuff, and because her account, they will bring organic feed to me. Merino sheep are a cross between Spanish sheep and African rams, and the Spaniards were very clever and learned a little bit like a Shar-Pei dog to breed a sheep that had lots of wrinkles in their skin, and that gave you more fibers per inch on their body. And they were a very hardy ram crossed with these African rams. And when our kids live in Africa, and when we go to Africa, I see merino sheep on the side of the road. But for a long time, through the 1500s, it was under penalty of death if you took a merino sheep out of Spain. But they ended up getting married to some English people, and the sheep were given as a wedding present. Okay. And that's how they ended up leaving Spain. And so that would have been how they all ended up in Australia, because there are lots of English people in Australia. And they are not totally suited to lush land like England nor Virginia, but our group has gotten a little more hardy over the years. Our ground is a little too wet. They, as a breed, they're probably used to drier, rockier ground.
Now, one of the questions I had is you grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, correct? And you were kind of fortunate enough to grow up in a business family, I guess. Dad was quite the prominent business guy in town, and was really happy to research and to learn a little more about him. How did that kind of affect you as a young girl, seeing Dad in business? I know you had some love for horses. One of your friends invited you over. You spent a lot of time over there at the horse farm.
Yeah.
How did that whole combination kind of push you to want to be on a farm, the rural living?
That's such a good point. All I ever wanted to do was live on a farm and ride horses and be on a farm. My father grew up in a town called Union Springs, Alabama, and in Union Springs, they would have the field dog trials every year. And so we would, as a family, because his mother lived there, we would go down for the field dog trials. And they would do all of that. I don't know if you're a quail hunter, but you would do it on horseback. So while they were out working the dogs, I got to ride horses in the back of the barns and riding. I fell in love with horses then, so I would have been very little then. Yeah. And I had an older sister, and we all ended up having best friends and ponies. And so we grew up riding there. And Dad, I would say he always had that country background in his bloodstream because he grew up in the country in Union Springs. But he ran a very big company and made a big impression on me with his integrity and honesty and hard work. And he was very focused on doing the best that he could. And so that probably would have been a big influence on me. My mother was a daughter of doctor, so she thought she was a doctor, and consequently, I also thought I was a doctor. But it's not a bad thing to have an interest in medicine because if you're raising animals, and I say this to people a fair amount, and then we'll talk about the dogs a little bit later, but having 3 sheep is very different than having 30 sheep, and having 30 sheep is very different than having 300. And you have different kinds of health issues that you never had before. And you also have different kinds of predator issues. And so horse vets are super eager to come out. Sheep vets are not necessarily coming out. So you learn to treat a lot of, and Pancho, who you saw, who we couldn't live without because he is so great on working on the farm. Everyone develops a really good eye and trying to figure out what's a healthy sheep. And so, for instance, as I'm looking this, and this is a great example, I feed them once a day just to have them come in so that I can look at them. Because the difference between a healthy lamb whose ears look like that and a not healthy lamb and their ears look like that. And so if you don't get the difference, you're going to miss. And the sheep are so stoic. They don't show you that they're not well. They'll come to breakfast and be dead in the afternoon. And so you have to start to learn to read them a little bit.
One of the articles that I read, probably a half a dozen articles about you, said that they were first. As a shepherd, obviously, your sheep are first. And there's been analogies all throughout history. You know, the shepherd is watching their sheep, and that's actually true. I mean, they're your first go-to in the morning. You think about your sheep.
Absolutely.
You don't get to the final product on your back unless you have healthy sheep.
No, and I definitely felt like I was very blessed. And a neighbor asked me this, because it's hard to make a living doing this, raising them all the way through to production. And he was asking me what was the most important part of it. And this is not a judgment about it. Some people are designers, and I'm a shepherd first. And so for me, the sheep are the part that's the most important to me. Right. And then the other one was really more of a farmer problem of, oh my God, we're making a couple of 1,000 pounds of wool. What am I going to do with all this wool? And so that was, in the very beginning, good advice from a friend. Said, well, make something that doesn't require sizes. So that was how we started out with capes and ponchos and mittens and socks, because what are you going to do if you run out of all the mediums and all you have are smalls left? So this is the electric fence. And that goes around the paddocks. And until we had about 30 sheep, we did not have any predator problems. But Virginia has 5 predators that are constant problems: coyotes, bears, eagles, and ravens. And 70% of your damage is done by your neighbor's dog, Fluffy. No one believes that Fluffy did it. And then you'll say, well, I have a trap camera and I have footage of Fluffy. And sheep are, there's a great saying that sheep are born trying to die.
Very timid, aren't they?
Well, they're not timid. They kind of give up, though, pretty quickly. And so it's not so hard for Fluffy. Even I've had the littlest dog that we had trouble with was somebody's terrier. He wasn't even knee high. And but I don't hold that against the dog. Dogs are just doing what dogs do. And I felt as a shepherd, my job was then to protect them. So the first thing that we did was we put electric fence around, and that immediately solved the problem of transient coyotes, because they would touch it once and then not come in. Then Fluffy, the neighbor, would know where the hole in the fence was, and he could get in. And then the eagles were a real problem. And so come, we'll meet the rest.
Okay.
This way.
So another question for you.
Yeah.
I read that you settled your first farm, it said, in the early 80s with your husband. Was this the farm?
No, we were over in Waterford, Virginia.
Okay. And when did you make the decision to say, okay, we're going to make a go of this?
The place in Waterford, I was a horse person solely at that point. And Walter, my husband, was in seminary at Virginia Theological Seminary.
Right.
So we didn't have any money. And in order to have a horse for me, I learned very early that if I kept 2 horses, that would pay for my 1 horse. So we took in boarders, and I was teaching riding lessons to little kids. Right. And that basically just left me even. But it allowed us to have the horses. And that was in Waterford. And then we moved here in the later 80s. Now, maybe 90, early 90. It's sort of interesting, just like these little lambs, without a leader, it takes them a minute to figure out what they're supposed to do. And so this would be like having a group of teenage boys. And once they figure it out, they come. Come on, guys. Come on. Also, sheep recognize faces, and they know they don't know you. So they would be thinking, is that the vet, or is that something that's going to happen? And hi, guys. You were so slow.
So you have, for lack of a better term, 3 types of sheep here. You have the ewes, the rams, and the yearlings.
Yes.
And you shear all of those.
Yes.
Does that get mixed, or do you use that separately, or do you mix it all together? How does that work?
That's a great question in terms of textiles, because if I were running a really big place, and I could do it even with the smaller one, but I would keep out the lamb's wool, and because that's your finest wool, and I would keep that aside.
That's the reason for the question, because I said it was really fine, so I was like, okay, maybe they keep that and do something.
So it's very fine. So that first shearing it's very valuable. I blend all of mine together, and it just makes the whole product better. But when you buy a sweater and it says that it's lamb's wool, it's from that first shearing that they've ever had. And then when you shear, you take all the wool off, but there are parts that are not undesirable, but somewhat undesirable from my end, like the belly and the neck, and it's full of debris in the neck, and the belly is coarser or muddier, and that falls into a category called waste wool. Okay. Waste wool is used for a lot of things, which are great. And there have been years, I don't think I did it last year, but I say because I'll have hundreds of pounds of waste wool, and that would go into like tennis balls and tennis shoes and stuffing for mattresses or things like that.
So when I was in your shop, I saw that you had slip-ons, sliders, and those kinds of things. Is that, as you call it, waste wool, or?
No.
Or is that?
And so this is a warning for the people that are concerned or squeamish. The rams, all my ram lambs go to market because they're related to everyone. Sure. And so we do shear them, but then they go to market, and we have several gourmet restaurants. And in the shop, there's a freezer. And so it's wonderful legs of lamb and ground lamb. So they go when they're a year old, and we use everything. So the sheepskins come back, and that's what makes the slippers.
I see. Okay.
So they have a great life, and we are very sad to see them go.
Yeah.
But all of it gets used.
So the cycle is about a year then
for these guys. These can live up into their teens, and the girls all stay here and continue to grow fleece. We shear them every year. If they have trouble lambing or something, we will take them off the breeding squad, but they will stay on the farm, and they just live here for their entire life.
So they're 10 to 15 year kind of lifespan for them.
Something like that, yes. So the wire was working great. Then we were having some more trouble as the flock got bigger. And I had a wonderful sheep vet named Donna Matthews, and she was from Luray, Virginia, and very experienced with sheep. And she also raised llamas. And so she said, why don't you use a llama? And llamas are very wise, and they have great eyesight, and they organize the sheep. So we got the mama llama, and she came, and for a long time, that definitely worked. She would move the sheep away from danger and take them into the shed or just to the other side of the field. And that worked really well. And then the eagles started coming. And we were losing 10 or 12 in the summer to eagles who would fly in and they would attack the sheep. And maybe worse than attacking it, not kill them, but maim them so much that we had to put them down.
Yeah.
So that was what led us to the guard dogs.
Bluto and Olive.
Bluto and Olive, they are awesome.
Yes, and I guess they're a Turkish Kangal dog, you said they?
Exactly.
Yeah. I noticed when you're walking around, you have a big smile on your face. But it seems like you really enjoy
I do love the sheep.
What you're doing.
Hey, girls.
Love the guys. Guys and girls.
We do love the sheep. And then that's, back to when it's going well, it's really wonderful. Yeah. And then when it doesn't go well, you try to figure out how do we solve these problems. And but when people are asking me about the products that we're making, I'm genuinely so proud of the sheep. They've made such beautiful wool that I feel like it's lucky that I get to actually grow my own fabric and see it all the way through to production.
Grown in Virginia, made in America, worn throughout the world. I read that. I thought that was brilliant. Very cool. That kind of leads me to another question. You've had opportunity in your life to go to some different countries, and I know you spent some time in England. You lived there for a bit, and the whole Africa thing. And then you're somewhat of an art aficionado. And I read that you got some of your designs from, Henri Matisse and some of those people, yes. Agnes Martin. And I think that's very interesting. How much of that goes into your designing, your love for art, your love for humanities, if you will, because it seems like there's a lot of it's involved in that.
Well, it's interesting. So answering that in two different ways, which is kind of interesting. Allbirds shoes, and Guy Risdall, if you ever listen to How I Built This, and he interviews the Allbirds people. And there's a section in there, and one was a professional soccer player, and the other guy was Harvard MBA, wanted to invest in good footprint businesses. And the professional soccer player was designing a shoe that he liked. And so they interviewed with someone who was properly in the shoe business. Mm-hmm. And that person said, which is what I related to, you actually know just so little about making shoes that this might work. And so I feel a little bit like that. I know so little about actually making clothes and designing clothes, but we've all worn clothes and you know what you like. And so I didn't have some of the roadblocks that I should have had because I just didn't know they were going to be roadblocks. So in thinking about what were we going to make with, and you're finding the inspiration, or what am I missing in my wardrobe that I would like to have. Sure. And we were living in London at the time, and I got to spend, because it's not my hometown, but my favorite city in the world, I got to spend a lot of time in art galleries. And so that definitely influenced some of the early designs. We have the first shirt that I ever did is called the Circle Shirt.
Yes.
And it was based on Matisse, the show I had seen in London, where he was in the cutout phase of his life. Yeah. And I thought, oh my God, we're making things. And when we cut the necks out, we have all this fabric left over and we could make a pocket on there. Or Agnes Martin, that was also a London show. And so different things inspired me in trying to figure out, well, I need a garment to do this, but why don't we reference for Agnes Martin? She does a lot of triangles in her work. And so that was the triangle tunic, a top that we make.
Yeah, I think Louis Vuitton has one of her pieces, actually. I read up a little bit on her. It's the two pyramids, the black pyramids. And I think they took a picture of it, and it was as a result of, it was in Louis Vuitton. So they evidently own that piece.
Well, and very interesting. They should see my triangle tunic. It's a great looking garment. And
I think we need to connect those dots.
Don't you think? And that was kind of interesting. So, and I couldn't figure out, I knew I wanted it to be a turtleneck, and I couldn't quite figure it out. And Vogue was having a show at the Portrait Gallery, and it was a Vogue 100, and they had some garments from the 1950s. And we had this pleat that was done, these inverted pleats, and I thought, here's the pleat. But I think life is very informative. And so you see things and you think, well, how could I do that, but a little bit differently? And again, it was mostly not wanting to have my sheep be ashamed of me. I felt like if they had gone to such trouble and made this incredible fleece, that I should make something very beautiful out of it. And so that was...
It's your way of honoring.
But the art world had a big influence, and it was just because I had a lot of spare time and ignorant enough that I didn't know to be afraid to try.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I've run into, the different people that I've interviewed, and even in my own case, I've been in business a long time. One of the things I wanted to do with a podcast, had no idea what I was doing, but I decided to do it and figure out the rest. Mm-hmm. So some of the things that I ran into, I didn't know I was going to run into, but if I hadn't put it out there and done it, I may not have done it.
Well, exactly. And I think marriages are always a great combination. My husband is way smarter than I am. And I am more of an operator of trying to figure out where I want to go and then figure out all the parts as we're going along. And I'm not saying that's the best way. It's just the only way I know how to operate. But I think there have been conversations in our lives about whatever it is we were doing with the sheep or with the farm. And mine would be, well, don't tell me all the ways it won't work. Let's figure out the ways that it will work. And what can we do to make it work? And
so that is one of my questions for you is how does your husband fit into your passion? How does he support you? Other than being your husband, how does he support you in this endeavor? Is he very complimentary to it? What is his role?
So it's a good thing that he's not here so I can claim that I do all the work myself. But he is absolutely supportive. And I would have to say he does more of the physical work than I do. He gets up every morning and feeds, and he and Pacho, they do it all together. He makes all the hay. He is 100% involved in the farm. And so he likes the routine of feeding the animals and moving the flock from pasture to pasture. And we do it all together, but he is hands-on. He and Pancho make all the hay on the farm. So we make all the hay that we feed on the farm and that are grown in those fields up front. And then we will start to shrink everybody up so that all the horses are in one paddock and all the sheep will still be in two paddocks, but they get into much smaller, and then we'll cut all this and turn this into hay. I'm looking at these other fields. All in all, we have 8 fields, and so we'll shrink everybody down to like 2 or 3 paddocks, and that leaves the others, and then up front is all open, and we make 1,000 square bales, and I can't remember how many round bales we make, but we feed them. And like this time of year, they're going through a bale a day. So that was a brand new bale this morning.
Oh, okay. The big round bales. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've seen your husband in some of your photo shoots. Obviously he enjoys your clothes.
Well, he gets to be my fit model. And so that, and this is actually his shirt, but it was new and we had to make it. And I wanted him to, and it's wool and silk. And I wanted him to wear it around the farm to make sure that it holds up and that the seams all work and that it's the right size.
Well, I can tell one of the articles I read said that I love their wool, their silly and joyful lambs, and their peaceful continence. Mm-hmm. So as you're out here working and you're the only one out here, you don't have a couple guys bothering you, this must be a pretty surreal place to be. It's serene.
It was so nice. And so often, and Walter, my husband, does this as well. My daughter now has coined the phrase shed therapy. Oh, yeah. Because so when we're lambing, the normal rhythm of lambing is that in the last few weeks before they're going to lamb, we know that we have it on the calendar, so we know when it's coming. And we will bring the moms in at night and we shut the gate. And that's just so that if they have the lambs at night, that it'll be undercover and in a warm place, warm, dry place. And so we will bring the sheep in and we all catch ourselves that we'll just hang out in the shed. And they're in. So my daughter started to call it shed therapy because you're hanging out on the one reason because you're looking to see who's doing what. And, just like then when I'm looking at those moms, which is exactly why we feed them. They're getting enough hay. They don't need the grain, and it's not getting enough per sheep to really help. But I want them to come up close so that I can see them up close. Yeah. But then we all find ourselves hanging out in the shed because it's very peaceful. And something soothing and healing about hanging out with the sheep. And when you're very still, they'll come up and be more friendly.
Now, you mentioned your kids live across the pond.
Yeah.
How often do you get to see them these days?
We're going to go see them next week, which is great.
Good.
So we're all going to the beach together. But our daughter and her husband and 2 children live in Kenya, and they were in Tanzania for a decade doing wildlife conservation. Wow. And then they thought the children should learn to read, so they moved to Kenya so that the kids could go to school. Okay. But they still do wildlife conservation. Wow. And so they live in a little town called Gilgil, and the kids go to Pembroke, which is a great school.
Amazing.
And they then, from where they are based, they go do wildlife projects. Like our son-in-law just moved a big group of rhino from an overcrowded park in Kenya to a more open space.
I think I saw a picture of you
doing African
stuff.
With
a rhino.
Could have been,
rhino. Yeah,
yes. And we were checking out those rhinos, which they had. That was probably in Tanzania. And there's a very specific rhino that they had been completely poached out, and so they had reintroduced them. And so we were checking on her. And then our son has been there also for about a decade, and he started a solar power company.
Okay.
And he's based in Nairobi and also does East Africa.
So I know that your husband had a part of the biggest telecommunication.
He did.
So is that where your son gets that kind of that?
Well, both of them, they get their African connection because Walter and I have been married for coming up 44 years. Okay. And all of those years, he, although he has a degree in theology, he also has a degree in international business.
Yeah.
And so Africa was his area of interest. And so he has his whole life worked on African issues, either in public policy or private sector. So the kids grew up here, forgetting more about Africa than most people because they would hear it around the table so much. Sure. And they both fell in love with it and then have stayed working there.
That's interesting. And that's another thing that the people that I interview, all of their history just feeds into their life. And so that always is interesting to me. And I call it, in a podcast, I want to know the grit behind the grind. Like, what's the upbringing? How did it force you, or how did it push you, or how did it pull you? And in your case, I mean, you've got a lot of things that have seemed like have molded you. And then obviously you get married and now you've got some overseas connections. Your kids are over there. I just think that's an interesting story for people. So from a sociological standpoint, your upbringing, your area you grow up in, the people you grow up around, that's a big effect in people's lives, negative and positive. Obviously, most of what I'm doing is more on the positive side, but it's I found it to be true when I talk to these guests. So it's
and that's a negative that turned into a positive. The predator management. I was so sad that we kept getting hit again and again by the eagles. And the eagle would grab the lambs by the neck and the talons would go all the way through their breathing apparatus. So I could put saline solution on one side and it would shoot out the other side of the neck. And in the summer, with fly strike and all those things, that was never going to be a good situation. And eagles were protected. And I don't want to shoot an eagle, but I just didn't want them. But I didn't see how I could protect them from air warfare. And so that was how this shed got built, because my first step, because we had the llama, but the llama can't guard against eagles. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll build a big enough shed that the flock can come in, we can close them in at night. And the eagles are mostly shopping at dawn and dusk. And so I was going to keep them in here and then just let them out later in the morning and then put them in at night. You're going to have to be brave.
We're standing here. We've got two stray
You're going to have to scoot past.
That want to scoot by.
Then I'm going to let them work it out. But so that was how this shed got built, because we were trying to figure out about the eagles. And I called a bunch of shepherds out west and they said, out west, when lambing season comes, there'll be 50 eagles on the fence. Wow. And they're waiting for the moms to start lambing. Again, the eagles just doing what eagles do, but my job was to keep my sheep safe. And so I thought, well, that's grim. So the shepherds out west said, you need a livestock guardian dog. And finding the right dog is super important, because if they're really good, people don't let them go. And so, but it will change your life completely. So that was how Olive and Bluto came on board. I had found a woman who, a little bit like the sheep, they were not allowed to leave. Kangals were not allowed to leave Turkey for a long time. And I mean, recently to like the 80s, but they were bred for hundreds of years to guard sheep from bears and wolves. And so you have this very brave dog that's willing to take on predators. But I knew that I was having bird problems.
Sure.
And so I found a woman in Kentucky, and she had been using Kangals to guard her cattle from vultures. And it's a type of vulture we don't have.
How about that?
And so, and that's the other piece of advice that people would say to me is you have to get a guardian dog that's from guardian dog parents, and somehow they learn it in vitro. And
is that right? That was one of my questions. How did
you just
train
get
the
a dog that's from a rescue thing?
Yeah.
They have to be born knowing how to do it.
Right.
And they kind of teach each other. And so she had these dogs in Kentucky, and that's where Bluto came from. And they sleep mostly during the day, which is why Bluto hasn't shown up. And then at night, we put tracking collars. We don't do it anymore, but tracking collars on them to know where they are on the farm. And they work all night long. They do the whole farm all night long. And they just keep everything out. And because they're here, so Bluto's been here now 4 years, 5 years. And we've not lost a sheep to a predator since.
Right? Not one.
No one comes in, and he knows intuitively when the moms are starting to lamb during the day, he sleeps in the field where they're lambing. And he just, because he's there, the birds don't come.
I imagine predators know after a while that there's,
they definitely
there's a
know.
dog there, so we're not going in there. That's interesting. That's interesting.
This episode of Grind to Growth to Greatness is brought to you by Terry Barr. Distinctive Real Estate. Advising families across Pennsylvania and Northern Virginia for over 15 years. Visit the website at terrybarrealestate.com.
So one of the articles I read, it talked about, and I think it must have been early on, that you kind of made the decision when you were making your fabric and making your clothes, and you felt a little guilty about the price.
Yeah, it's expensive.
And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But as I read further, you had a quote there that made me really stop and think. It says, when you buy things really inexpensive, the price tag on humanity is way too high. And I thought that was an interesting quote, because if you think about that, it's so true.
Absolutely acknowledge. The only way this works is that my husband has an outside job because we wouldn't be able to afford to do it. And then you would have to get into huge quantities to actually make a living doing it. But you're right. And so when you buy a $20 shirt, there's human trafficking involved somewhere, or people are not being paid fair wages, or as I was talking about the superwash, they're doing things to it in another country that is not fair. In India, you have so many children that have poison from spinning silk, and the dyes that go into it, the chemicals that go into doing it are not great for humanity. So I don't know how to get around it. My prices are, that's just what it costs when you pay fair wages. And so I lean towards trying to make that's why it's important that the garment doesn't fall apart, that you purchase well and then wear it for a long, long time.
Well, for those of you that are listening, Franny sends her product, once it's processed, sends it out to artisans across the United States, which I thought was very interesting. You've looked up these artisans and you found them, and that's where you're shipping your product, and they're making these beautiful, I bought something today, and it's from Texas. The manufacturer person, the person that knits that or manufactures that, is from Texas. And so I thought that was an interesting way to not only do something right here in Virginia, but to support the artisans, because they're far and few between anymore. They're harder to find.
Well, and I go to groups from time to time, and I do a farm to fashion chit chat. And when we were talking about language, and it used to be a long time ago, in your neighborhood, you knew who the spinster was, She was often a single woman who spun all your yarn. And you also knew who the weaver was. And it's all through our language where if something's twisted, that's a reference to yarn that's been twisted or woven together or plied me. And those are all parts of our language that come from, it would have been very embedded in your lifestyle. You would have known who your weaver was and who your spinster was. So this goes back to me loving the sheep. And if I make a shirt that's, and this came up in the Allbirds comment, if they were trying to figure out how to market their shoes, and the shoe person who made shoes said, you know what, the story is great unless if the shoe's not good looking, nobody cares what the story is. And so it is important that the garment is beautiful.
It's beautiful.
But when I see the shirt or the capes that we make, I see that lamb that was born and its mother, and David who spun it, and Rabbit who wove it, and Pauline who sewed it. And so for me, it's living fiber, and it represents a whole family of artisans who put their stamp on it all along the way. So it's very meaningful. But again, at the end of the day, if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, if it doesn't keep you warm, or if it falls apart, it's...
Right. So what do you think, what happens to this in the future? What's the legacy that you're trying to leave with what you're doing?
You know, to me, in some ways, it is definitely embedded in my faith, and that when God gave the people the talents, and some turned it into something, and some hid it under, what is it? Was it the rock, or they hid it under the bushel basket or something like that? And so I did feel like it was a huge privilege that I got to live on a farm, and then my other directive seemed to be that I should do something with this land that I was lucky to live on. And so that to me meant producing it. And that then I joke about that my life was going great till I had children, and the children ruined my life. And then, so of course I thought, well, we should grow all our own food and make all our own clothes. And that was as you do. Yeah. And so that then led me to the big vegetable garden and the spinning and the knitting. And then all of a sudden you have a lot. And then people would say, can we buy more of those mittens? And I would put them out on the dining room table, and they would come, and I'd leave an honesty box, and they would come and take the mittens that they wanted, or the baby hats. And so it grew naturally from just being in the barn and with my own family. But then it felt more important than just me and my farm and my family, because I was running into all those problems that you couldn't find the mills, or you couldn't find the artisans, because it had all been offshored. And then it was taking place. And I thought, gosh, we have so much here. And there are lots of other, I'm definitely one of the smaller people, but there's a great company. I don't know the people, but I follow them. They're out west, but they have thousands of sheep, and they bought the textile mill so that they then, and they make with their merino wool, like thermal, undergarments that you wear, base layers and stuff like that. And, but because they do such a huge amount where they have thousands of sheep, then it starts to be more manageable in terms of a business. I mean, it's a lot more work, but it's more cost effective. And so I am old and thinking I shouldn't be building things, but I also do think it's important to use the whole farm. And that was the genesis of it.
So I guess when we walked up, we were talking to Chris and about financing some other things. And there's a point where, like you said, you're either too small to get what you need, or you're too big to do it the way you want to do it. And you've kind of backed off, and you've got a couple hundred sheep, and that seems manageable. But what's next? Like, obviously Chris is here, so maybe we're thinking about.
I know. Well,
what is
and
next?
so
right.
Chris, and my margin has gotten a little bit bigger. Literally, I've never paid myself. The girls who work in the shop get paid, and I do it because I love it. But the sheep are feeding themselves, and they are earning their feed. And it used to be the next $10,000, if I put it into the business, it was either bankrupt me or it would be the next step. Sure. And so, for instance, if I were saying, well, where would I like to go next? And it would be to be able to pay the 5 employees that we really need for it to go to the next level. Because if you were going to actually have an online store that was cost effective in terms of numbers, and that goes back, I'm going to keep using the Albert example, but he describes his business in the very beginning. He said, I had 1,000 shoes. I didn't have anything. Well, I've never made 10 of anything. I mean, so that we were in way different. And so when you're in the clothing business, we probably made a dozen of these shirts. And you don't get any sort of cost benefit until I'm making 300. And our farm's just not big enough. And you're all of a sudden having to be in a whole nother category in terms of quantity. And
on average, what does it take you to get one of those made for us from a timing standpoint? How much product or how much wool?
That's kind of interesting.
How long?
And so, yes, and we were talking about it earlier about having the wrong size and the wrong color, no matter what. So say I thought of something today and I wanted to have it hanging in the store. From the day I think of it, it takes 2 full years to get it to the hanger. And so then it is... And I don't ever have any problem with someone's a knitter and then they come in and they see the price of the sweater is $600. And if they are a knitter, they understand absolutely why it costs that. But we're so used to buying things that are so much 50, more 60, inexpensive. 80, 100,
whatever,
But if you look at how many hours it took, and so the lamb is born and then has to grow for a year, and then we shear it and wash it and card it and spin it and weave it, and then it turns into, it takes a long, long time. And so the only way that becomes effective is if you get into numbers. Well, I don't want to chase that at this stage of my life. If I were younger and if my kids lived here, I would probably, they are so proud of it. So I'm pleased that they're proud of it, but they keep wanting me to do it. But at this point, I'm happy to hold my ground of that this farm is producing and feeding itself, and it's useful. But I think
it's not beating you to death.
No, and I thoroughly enjoy it, and I love it. When we just came back we do a lot of shows. We just came back from Nashville, and people will come in wearing the garments that they bought from the years before, and they want the new pieces that have come in. And so I definitely can see that the story is important to them as well. That it's that we are, and that's another piece that was. My mother is literally 100 years old, and so she loves my clothes, which is great, and her friends like my clothes. But they came from the generation that thought of industrialization, and so they're not interested in the story that I know the lambs and see it all the way through, because they were smart enough to think about how to get a machine to do it, but our children are desperate for this connection, and they want to know the sheep, faith, hope, and patience, and that it really does tether us to this earth. And I see that all the time, because when I'm not in my booth and I'm at the show, and the Nashville show has 10,000 people coming, and I will come back to my booth, and Francis might have been sitting in there, but there'll be people in there telling the story to the next people. So they're interested in it. And
passing it along for
they're definitely passing it along for me, but it means they're invested in it. And I'm glad, because that turns into sales. But I mostly see that it has a spiritual significance to people.
Yeah, I've read that in a couple of your articles of spiritual significance. And now that you've started to talk about that, in what you're saying is that, look, I've been blessed to be able to live on a farm, to have this land, to have these sheep. And so therefore, I feel like I should honor that. Is that what you mean by spiritual significance?
Well, yes, and then also, that was when the children came along, and that every parent's need, that you want to have your children feel their place and this connectedness, and especially in America, the food that you eat and everything, they don't know where that comes from. And so to grow it on your farm, you have a whole different respect for it. I used to do the farmer's market, and that would be always fascinating to me to see the people come and look at the food, and then they would talk about the price of it, and it is such a better deal than the potato chips that I love to eat every day.
Way.
Yes.
In every way.
So,
and that's interesting because you started out with that type of a farm. You were doing vegetables.
I was doing vegetables and vegetables and horses, and then the sheep came after
later,
that.
As a result of that gift that turned into your passion.
Right? Which it does. And then you can't help but love it. I mean, it is very charming. It was sort of funny during COVID. It became, I never said no to anybody because I felt like they really needed it. We had lots of our daughter's friends and with little bitty children who would come out, and because people weren't going anywhere or getting to do anything. And I said, absolutely, come out. You can help me feed and then they got to be a part of it. But I could see that it was important for them to see what was happening on the farm, and that made COVID go by really kind of fast because the animals were hungry every single day, and life kept going.
That's an experience. Well, I mean, most kids maybe your kids' friends are privy to that because they're close to you, but that's an experience most kids don't get to have anymore. And that used to be the norm. My dad grew up on a dairy farm. Of course, he didn't like it. But, he was in farms in Michigan. That was what he grew up doing. But,
well, that's hard work in Michigan.
Yeah.
Milking twice a day. Well, we used to have a milk cow, and her name was Lyra, and we loved her, and she was a Jersey. And but that was just for our own consumption.
Sure.
And no one ever flunked the milk test because they would come and be a little bit nervous about drinking fresh, raw milk. And so we would put out little shot glasses of store-bought milk and fresh milk and say, which one do you like better? And fresh milk won every single time. But, and it was just great fun. Yeah. And the kids definitely enjoyed it. And it was important for people to see, I know during COVID, on the negative side, and maybe you know this as well, the whole wool market crashed. So the wool that we make in this country, 85% of it goes to China, because it then gets turned around into a sweater and garments and comes back and is still a third the price of what it costs us. So that's shocking in itself and intuitively wrong that we can grow all this wool in this country, ship it to China, turn it into something and ship it back, and it's still cheaper but COVID came and China didn't come buy our wool. And so all of a sudden, all these farmers were stuck with wool with no place to sell it. And so that to me was also very worrisome of where we've gotten ourselves in this country by offshoring things so much.
So what is the difference? Merino wool is obviously a special type of wool, but the big growers, if you will, in America that, like you said, they got stuck with, what sort of wool are they putting out? What's the difference between their wool and your wool?
So merino wool is, those Spaniards made that to be very fine, and you can wear it next to your skin, and it's measured in what's called micron counts.
I gotcha. Okay.
And so it's like a golf score. The lower your micron count, the finer it is. And the finer it is, the more pleasant it is to wear next to your skin. And so our wool is a 19 micron count.
Okay.
And that's in a category called ultrafine. And
so my T-shirt is probably what, like
it would probably, if you're going to wear it as a
count?
T-shirt, it's going to be a fine wool or lamb's wool.
Gotcha.
But if you're wearing one of those fisherman sweaters, that's a much coarser wool.
Wow, aren't
and they all have their place in our lives.
Sure.
Like my wool would be terrible for carpeting.
Yeah.
Because you need a very coarse fibered wool. Nice. And often that's coming from your meat sheep.
Okay.
So the people that are growing lamb for restaurants and for the meat business, they are 100 pounds in 100 days, and their wool is much coarser. And
so they're sharing what, 3 times a year?
No, just saying once a year, but they are much faster to market. So and maybe it's just my particular farm, but my merino sheep aren't 100 pounds until they are a year old. And I do send all my ram lambs to market, and that is, I think that makes the merino meat much sweeter, and it doesn't have that gamey lamb taste because I think it's so slow growing, or on our particular meat is very slow growing. So there are all kinds of wool for different purposes, and it's why our military uses it, because it's a flame retardant, and it keeps you warm when it's wet, and it has like all these properties that are fabulous. But the finer it is, you can wear it closer to your skin, and the coarser it is, you would use it in other ways. But it's all good. It's just different things.
One of your quotes that I enjoyed was, I would like to be able to keep making beautiful things that are inspiring to people and honor the sheep and their wool. And I think you've done that for me anyway. I subscribed to a magazine you were in recently, Northern Virginia, the magazine. And I always give it to my mother-in-law, and she reads it, and she opened it up and read your article. And she said, Terry, you need to read this. And I'm like, I don't have any interest in sheep. And she goes, no, you really need to read this. And so she kept pestering me through the evening. So I finally picked it up. Wow. I was like, this is inspiring. This is such a neat story. And I just think how you connect everything together with your desire to do what's right and honor the sheep and honor your land. And, I think it's just a wonderful thing.
Well, they did I think it was Northern Virginia Magazine, did an article on working dogs. And so Bluto was featured in that. And he is, that has become, if I have just started to dream about the sheep, I am so grateful to these dogs. And so every day I see them, I am always saying to them, thank you for your service. And so they're kind of interesting. And back to what we were talking about earlier, where you don't train these dogs. It's like quarter horses cutting cattle. They kind of know how to do it already. And the good ones, you couldn't think to tell the horse quick enough to tell it what to do, that they have to intuitively know. And so Bluto will decide what he thinks is safe and not safe. And so that's always fascinating.
And that's usually better for you than you would think, right?
Well, and so we trusted judgment. And I've learned that raising Olive has been, it's an art, not a science. And so I do have to help her make good decisions, because some livestock guardian dogs in their teenager years, I couldn't figure out, I kept seeing this feed on my Instagram from these Kangals in Turkey. And I would see several of the dogs were tethered to donkeys. And I couldn't quite figure out what that was about until I had Olive hit her teenage years. And they want to chase things and do things they're not supposed to do. And I realized that's what those shepherds are doing. They've tied them to a donkey because the dog wants to chase the sheep, the young sheep, and play with them. And the donkey just sits down and said, not today. And I was wishing I had donkeys for my teenagers when I was growing up. But Bluto is just great at figuring out what it is. And so he will think everything's just fine. And our nephew was here from Colorado. And I'm hoping we'll see Bluto. Maybe he'll be down by the barn when we come back. But the nephew and his wife and the children, and just like Olive, he was very friendly with everybody. And then later, the lighting was beautiful, and the nephew got out to take some pictures of the sheep. And he pulled the camera out, and the camera's looking at the sheep. And Bluto stood between him and the sheep, he warned him. And he's like, I don't really know you. I met you with them, but now you're doing something, and it's aiming at the sheep. And he decided that wasn't a good thing. And so he stood between the sheep and the nephew, and he does, when his first warning bark is this sort of, it's the opposite of a loud barking, yapping dog. It's scarier. It's the other way. And he just goes, whoo. And when he does that a couple of times, you realize, oh my God.
Whatever I'm doing,
I'm not going to do it anymore. Nobody has ever challenged him, and he's never gotten in a fight with anything. But that was, I should have found out when they first came. But Kangals are kind of an interesting dog. And when a dog bites something, it's measured in pounds per square inch. And I'm making up these numbers a little bit. So like when a Rottweiler bites something, it's 180 PSI. And when a Pit Bull bites something, it's 232. Those numbers might not quite be right.
Sure.
But when a Kangal bites something, it's 743.
Oh, wow.
And that's bigger than a lion. A lion is like 500 or 600 pounds per square inch.
Wow.
And so if they are deciding to bite, but they are the kindest, most smart most clever dogs I've ever been around because they kind of decide what it is and they posture and they take a stand and you just don't challenge it. And so that's kind of cool. And when they are deciding something's dangerous, like these fences, they just jump right over these.
Oh, is that right? They just jump right over.
So because it has the electric wire. And if they have decided that there are dogs in the neighborhood that are doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, he'll just jump this like an in and out and then go and
so what
guard
happens,
the perimeter.
What happens to a sheep if there's danger out there? Do they recognize the danger?
Yes, and because they've been attacked by dogs so much, my dogs will actually move away from my own dogs. But they will know that danger is happening and they'll run as a group. And that was actually sort of funny in the beginning with the llama. The vet said, have you heard the llama do its llama call? Have you heard a llama call? So you have. All right. Well, so I had never heard one. We were actually digging potatoes and somebody came through and the llama did make a call and it sounds a bit like a peacock. It's like, ah, ah, ah. And when our llama did that, all the sheep ran and stood right behind her like a cotton ball. Wow. And I thought that was the most military maneuver I've ever seen in my life. But so now when Bluto comes in and if they know he's upset, they will go in a group and get to the opposite side. And he will stand between them and whatever the danger is. I have a great little bit of footage buried somewhere in my Instagram of a raven it was a vulture, was getting way too close to the day-old lambs. And I was watching so I had my camera and I'm filming Bluto and he's in the shed and he can see the raven and he's just watching it like on it. And as the vulture gets too close to the lamb, he decides to go and chase it away, but he doesn't want to upset the moms. And so he walks through the moms and the babies, and then he takes out after the vulture and won't let it stay. And so that's, that part, and actually on that particular day when he finished, I wish I had kept filming. He comes back and he and the mom go nose to nose. And there was just a moment.
Like she was saying thanks.
And then that was it. And they don't normally interact like that. But once he did that, they did the nose to nose. And then they were like, okay.
That might be your next project. Kangle dogs.
Well, this woman did such a good job. I looked at one set of livestock guardian dogs in Maryland. And a lot of people that keep livestock guardian dogs, they all live out because that's where they're working. But some shepherds never ever touch them at all, and they're almost feral. And this woman felt like they should be at least trained and manageable because I had gone to look at a dog in Maryland that was available, and they said, well, the dog, if a toddler goes into the field,
right.
The dog will like the toddler because they like babies, but they might not let the parents get the child back.
Oh, boy.
And I said, well, that's definitely not going to work because we had way too many people coming and going on the farm. And so I've made a point to, hey, guys, we already fed you.
So I see that bucket again, Mom.
I know. They're like, could I look closer? Because I have a feeling something's in there. So and she has an interesting, she would be another interesting podcast for you.
Okay.
She made a movie, which is how I found her. Her name is Elizabeth Jensen. And the company is called Evans Mill Cattle Company.
Okay.
And somebody had come and did a episode on Kangle dogs. That was how I found her, I think, just going down the rabbit hole of looking for dogs for sale.
Well, it sounds like you got the right dogs.
They have worked great for us.
Do they get along as a pair?
When Olive came, Bluto did not want to have anything to do with her. And he was ignoring her because he's working.
Yeah.
And she was like the kid sister. She was 3 months old. And she was on him like white on rice. And wherever he went, she would go, and you could see he hated it. He was just rolling his eyes. And as they've gotten older, they have become affectionate towards each other. But when I'm tracking them at night, unlike a foxhound, a pack of hounds.
Sure.
They work separately at night.
Do they really?
Mm-hmm.
How about that?
And so sometimes they're together and sometimes they're not. But if they are separate and they've run into some sort of something, a danger, like if a bear is coming in the farm or something, they will call and the other one will come and back them up. So because she's in her teenage years, she goes to bed at night. And Bluto's out there somewhere. But we're getting her through the spring, and then she'll get to be out all the time.
Oh, does she come inside in the house?
I put her in the stall at night because she roughhoused with a lamb.
Oh.
And she's done it. She did it last year in January and the year before. And I don't know what that is. And then all the rest of the time, she's really very good.
So I know one of your hobbies is riding horses, and I'm assuming you do some hunter jumper stuff.
I did. I rode competitively for a while doing jumpers, and then we've switched to fox hunting, and so that's what we do with these horses here.
Does your husband do that as well?
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's nice.
Everybody rides in the family.
Oh,
which
that's
is
great.
Nice. And when we were living in England, actually all of these horses came from England, and that guy's going out tomorrow morning. The one on the far end.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. I think we've made some great ground. I want to thank you for having us out. You know, you were more than kind and humbled. It was just a humbling thing to have us out. So I really appreciate that. I love your story. I wish you all the best. I supported you today for my wife's birthday tomorrow.
That was crazy. Thank you.
I'm super excited. By the time this comes out, she'll already get what I got her, so she won't hear this. But it's just fascinating to me, and you're the true meaning of Grind to Growth to Greatness. So thank you for having us.
Thanks for coming. I love sharing it.
You've been listening to the Grind to Growth to Greatness podcast. Our passion is to talk to the brightest entrepreneurs, CEOs, creators, athletes, anyone who's made it, and dive into their struggles, their successes, and their secrets. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Grind to Growth to Greatness. See you next time.